Hello everyone, happy to welcome you to today's Keys webinar on lessons from inflationary times. We'll be exploring how people around the world are reacting and coping in today's very disrupted environment, very uncertain, with consumer confidence at record lows. And we'll also reflect on what we can learn from other periods, other times of inflation that we have lived through. And also how businesses and brands can still continue to create value in these environments. As usual, we will have Simon with us, who will help us frame the discussion. He's going to take us on a tour of the public opinion around the world. Then Jean-Christophe, who is joining us from Santiago de Chile, will share his learnings from Latin America. And we know that Latin America is a region that has been living with inflation for a long time. We'll see how marketeers have adapted there to the impact that cost of living has on consumers' needs and desires. He will be followed by The Courage to Grow with Janice in New York. She will discuss how businesses can find the courage to still grow in these difficult times. And finally, Aurélie and Laurent in Paris will talk about communicating value based on new analysis that Ipsos has carried out on how retailers and brands can get their message right. And they will also share great examples of advertising that can be inspiring for us all. And before I hand over to Simon, I just want to let you know that this time we're going to have a little slot for questions at the end. So please, during the presentation, don't hesitate to click on the little question mark in the right pane and type your question. We will choose a few to give you the answer live as we wrap up our session later this afternoon. And with that, I will hand over to Simon in London.
Well, thank you, Jennifer. Thank you, everybody, for being with us today. And as Jennifer says, what we wanted to do is to start the webinar by just thinking a little bit about the public mood out there and really try to focus in on what feels most important to them at the present time before we get really into the detail of inflation and all of that entails. So we're using a study that we do every month as our reference point. It's called What Worries the World? And in 29 countries, we ask people to tell us what they find most worrying in their country. We always have the same list. We'll go through it in a moment, and we ask it every month. So it's a really good tracker and reference point as to where the public mood is. If we go back in time, just 9 months to the start of the year, how did it start? Well, it started with coronavirus at the top of the league table in terms of being the #1 worry around the world. Not quite reaching those heights of 60 or 70% at the start of the pandemic, but still there as the main preoccupation. Today's chart has it much further down the chart, number 10 in the league table, and we have the joint lowest score since the start of the pandemic. And again, who knows what the coming period will bring, but that coronavirus, not quite such a prominent topic as it was. Now we'll look at inflation in more detail in just a moment, but wanted to look at numbers 2, 3, 4, and 5 on the table just briefly, because they serve as a reminder, really, that often we're looking for those big changes, that coronavirus is down or inflation is up, and this reminds us that the big issues don't go away. Questions about whether I've got enough food on the table, how I feel about how my area or my country is being run, whether I've got a job, whether I feel safe. Many of us will have studied these hierarchies of needs at university or on courses. Very, very prominent here. Whenever we ask people to tell us what's most bothered them, these are the topics which come on day in, day out: pandemic or no pandemic, inflationary spiral or no inflationary spiral. Jean-Christophe will pick up on those topics a little bit in his review in a moment. The other thing I wanted to just draw on before we get into inflation is climate change. Tends not to be absolutely at the top of the list, but it is moving up the charts, and particularly in Western Europe in recent months. And we're going to look just for a moment at France, which of course has been through those terrible heat waves during the summer. We have 34% of people in France now singling out climate change as one of the big issues facing their country. And it's the biggest number we've seen in any country this year on that measure. And to keep the French example going, 68% of people in that country say that climate change is already having a severe effect on the area where they live. And this is a study which has 34 different countries in it, so you can dive into the nations or areas that you want to look into in more detail. I have to say that it's perhaps some of the most striking public opinion studies we've done in recent months, because in addition to that question on the effect climate change has had, we've got 71% expecting climate change to have a severe effect in the next 10 years. And we've got a third saying they think it's likely that they will be displaced from their home as a result of climate change. And the figures in India, Turkey, Malaysia and Brazil are pretty striking there. So in our webinar deck, which we'll be sending you, all of these results are there. Places questions, of course, about how we act as individuals, how our governments respond, but also how the organisations we work for respond. And one of the topics that comes into play is about how best to communicate in this current environment. We're going to hear more from Aurélie and Laurent in a moment on this topic, but we have a partner piece of analysis to the work that they've been doing, which is looking at sustainability and advertising and asking the question about how you can communicate effectively around these topics, and how you can show what your organization, your brands, your services can do to make a contribution. And one of the big things that the team have highlighted is the importance to make sure that you are not in the sea of sameness, and you are in some ways showing honesty and believability in the messages that you're putting across. Onto inflation. I think one thing that we particularly can draw on from the What Worries the World study, of course, is the change over time here. This was the start of the year. 20% of people, if you look at the top of the chart, we're identifying inflation as one of the biggest issues facing their country at the start of the year. It's now 40%. And in every single country that we've been working, we're seeing a movement, if you like, in the right-hand direction of the chart as people get more and more concerned about what's happening around them. And we've got a new piece of work which we released earlier this month, which goes into a little bit more detail there on people's sentiments. And I think the big headline for today, in terms of how people feel, is that current expectations are that there is more yet to come here. We think inflation is going to keep on rising. We're worried about what it means for taxes. We're worried about what it means for jobs in our country. And we also are concerned that our standards of living or our disposable income may be about to fall. But as you can see on the lower half of the chart, it's not a completely consistent picture. And one of the questions, of course, is how you can build your own strategies to respond to this environment. And that really forms the next stage of our webinar. So before I finish, just to mention that we've tried to pull these resources together for you. They're all available on the homepage of the webinar. And it includes a piece of work from our colleagues in the US, which is very much a partner to the work you'll hear from Janice in a moment about where we can find the courage row. We'll also be hearing in a moment from Latin America with Jean-Christophe. We've also got a webinar that we're running tomorrow in India, the world's 5th largest economy now, looking at perspectives there about how to manage the current situation and make the right decisions. So that's the end of our short introduction, as we try to capture a little bit about how people feel right now. I'll hand back to Jennifer in Paris.
Thank you very much, Simon. And it was a great presentation to give us a bit of an update on the context. And before we dive into the intricacies of Latin America with Jean-Christophe, I was wondering if you had any top line sort of information, data, insight on that region that you could quickly summarize for us?
Yes, well, we do. And I think it's a reminder, Jennifer, that one generalizes at our peril, because Argentina and Chile, for example, are towards the more worried end of the spectrum when it comes to inflation. I know Jean-Christophe will touch on Argentina in a moment, whereas Brazil and Peru are less likely than the let's say the global average to be worried about inflation, even though it's still around a third of people concerned there. So again, a reminder, if it were needed, of how we need to often look at that country level context if we are to be really in tune with how people are feeling.
Yeah. Great. So not everything is the same, and very happy to listen to Jean-Christophe now, who will put a little bit of color in this and give us his direct perspective on the ground.
Yes, thank you very much, Jennifer. Thank you, Simon. So good morning, good afternoon to everyone. So let's talk about Latin America and some learning regarding inflation. So the first point, talking about inflation and talking about Latin America, the first point is inflation. This is something, at least nothing new in the region. If we look a bit at the history over the last 40 years, we can see that in Latam we have a long history of high inflation, and the inflation has been always over US and Europe, and the inflation was particularly strong during 80s and during 90s. Now, during 80s and 90s, as you can see on this slide on the left side, we had hyperinflation in some countries, and we were talking about hyperinflation around 80s and 90s. We are talking about 1,000 or more than 1,000% inflation, as we have had in Brazil, in Argentina, in Peru, or more recently in Venezuela. But over the last 20 years, overall, the inflation has been mostly between 5–10% and closer to 10%. And recently, over the last few years, we have the specific case of Argentina with an inflation at around this year expected around 100%, so significantly high. But based on this, how the people feels right now in the region. And I think one of the first point, and maybe at least an important point, is that what inflation means, it means a significant impact on poverty. If we look at what's happening today in the region, food and energy are the main contributors to inflation. I mean, 60% of the inflation in Brazil, or 66% in Brazil, 60% in Colombia of the inflation is explained by the price increase in terms of food and energy. And food and energy represent a significant share of the consumption basket of the household in the region, over 40% in Peru, in Mexico, or in Brazil. So overall, this inflation, which is linked to day-to-day consumption, is putting a significant pressure on household disposable incomes, and especially, of course, on the poorest and the most vulnerable people. So if we look at some sentence coming from a regional or global institution, overall, the CEPAL, which is the Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean, is expecting to have a poverty level increasing and being over 2018, I mean, before the COVID period, and this level of poverty could switch from 30% in 2018 to 34% in 2022 in all the population in the region. So at the end, adding 8 million people with the risk of falling under food insecurity. And if we look at the World Bank, and this is quite recent, now we're talking about last month, August 2022, Latin America, as many people know, it's the most unequal region in the world, and of course, this inflation context could add social tensions. So, and today, when we look at our number, 4 in 5 Latin American consumers are concerned that price increase in 2022 will outpace their income growth. So based on this, what does it mean concretely, and how marketers and companies are reacting to this new context? So the first point, what we saw in the past, when there is high inflation level, high inflation bring impoverishment, now as we have seen on the previous slide, and what consumers are doing, they are switching budgets based on necessity, and we can see, or we saw in the past, that only CPG volume as the most essential category remain quite flat. Now we have a significant down in terms of consumption or in terms of volume, in terms of entertainment, in terms of restaurant, in terms of clothes and fashion. but also some decline in home electronic, home appliance, beauty product, and overall the single category will remain relatively flat in terms of volume is food and groceries. Even within CPG or within food and groceries, there is significant volume variance based on most essential categories and brands. What I mean, if I take food and beverage, for example, we can see, or we saw in the past, that pasta and milk remain relatively flat in terms of volume, but some categories which maybe are less essential, like yogurt or mineral water, have significant decline. And even within this category, which are relatively flat, or whatever the category is at the end, but even with each of these categories, there is a switch between brands, and we observed generally an increase of value brand. Mainstream brands are the most affected, and the premium brand remains relatively flat, as of course we have part of the population which are relatively rich, and they want to keep their status, and they continue to consume premium brand. But overall, when you look at this switch between category and switch between brand within each categories, overall we are facing a different market structure. If we look at all the consumer behavior in terms of their purchase process, overall they tend to use more, or to shop more with the list of essential. This is linked to the rationalization, to the focus on must-have categories and product and brand. They shop as they get money, most often smaller amount. They shop more often, but smaller amount. And each time they get a bit of money, they try to make stock as much as possible because everything will be more expensive the next day. They are shopping in much more different stores, looking for promotion, deals, coupon, because there is much less price reference and bigger difference between price for the same product or same SKU. They shop more online. It's easier for price comparison, and they shop more using apps comparing price. Now, for example, in Argentina, there is different apps like Donde Comprar or Comprando, and consumer can use these apps, and based on where they are, they can find the shop where they can find the best price or the best opportunity or promotion. So all marketers are reacting to this context. And here I'm taking 3 examples of multi-Latinas or big Latin American companies. So GBS is the world's largest meat company in Brazil. What has done GBS? They accelerated their direct consumer sites with an e-commerce platform selling ready meals and various types of protein online. Also, so talking directly to the consumer. Itaú, which is the largest banking institution in LATAM, based in Brazil, consistently invests in technology in order to increase efficiency and productivity. So at the end, to do the same with less employees and less cost. And maybe the last one, the most interesting one, Coca-Cola FEMSA. Coca-Cola FEMSA is the biggest worldwide Coke bottler based in Mexico. Significantly invests in returnable bottle capacity to mitigate the increase in raw material used, but also take advantage of big data analytics to optimize price, discount, promotion in a more granular way, but also in a more real-time way. So this is 3 examples of big multi-Latinas in the region. But basic marketing principle remains true, and here some LATAM examples. So understand elasticity and suitability of your product category. Is it a must-have or not? What we can see, for example, in Argentina is consumers switching from classical restaurant to more fast food. Reduce your cost, smaller product or lower production cost formula for the same price. An example is Super Ocho in Chile, the most famous chocolate bar in the country. And overall, having a smaller product but without price increase. Innovate remain important to improve differentiation and uniqueness. An example here is in Brazil, the launch of the instant espresso in Brazil on the commoditized instant coffee market has been very successful over the last few months. And think about your product portfolio. Kraft, for example, develop product offering across good, better, best, the right product at the right price. So a different kind of product portfolio. So at the end, learnings from Latin America, consumer mindset. So what we saw, what's happening with the consumer. Overall, there is a clear higher impact on the poorest and the most vulnerable household. There is a trade-off, a switch between category to more essentials and must-have. There is a much more rational and time-consuming purchase process as there are less price reference and bigger difference in terms of price. And we also saw an acceleration of e-commerce. So regarding brand and marketing mindset, review your product brand portfolio, UNA, substitution, price elasticity by segment, brand value, proposition, be innovative. And we saw some example, lower cost formula, portfolio solution, and rationalization of the portfolio, differentiation, be very reactive, test and adjust, be empathic with the consumer mood. And overall, in a high inflation context, what we saw in the past, there are always winner and loser. It's not business as usual, and you act better when you are sure.
Great, thanks so much, Jean-Christophe. And I think you shared some great examples, so it's really nice to bring all this to life for us. I was wondering, you have been based in Latin America for many years, I think like over 20 years, so you've seen lots of this and lots of what was happening. Is what you're living now any different from what has been happening over the past 20 years, or is it the same?
Yes, no, I mean, the level of inflation has a significant impact. No, it's true that it's quite different right now than what we saw, for example, I was living in Argentina early 90s, and at this time we had 1,000% inflation. No? So it was a totally different context. I remember that time, every day I was changing my US dollar. Every day I was changing 2, 3, 5 US dollars. And the price was changing all the time. So it was a totally different period. It was a bit extreme, let's say. But I'm talking about Argentina in 90s, but over the last 2-3 years in Venezuela, it was quite similar, no? Because in Venezuela, we saw inflation about 2,000-3,000%. And yes, it's a totally different context with the level of inflation we can see right now. Argentina is a bit specific now, because in Argentina right now, we are close to 100%. So of course, that is a very significant impact. But yes, 1,110%, it's quite different.
So you basically learn to live with it, in other words. So thanks for that, and thanks also for the tips that you shared, your recommendations to brands, because that leads us very nicely into what Janice is going to present, and we're all very keen to hear your advice, Janice, as to what brands need to be thinking about. Thank you very much, Jean-Christophe, and over to you, Janice.
Thank you, Jennifer. So we've heard from Simon and Jean-Christophe about the impact of inflation on consumers. And the question now is, from a business perspective, how to navigate this uncertainty, and then how to develop strategies to drive growth in these inflationary times. And when we set about answering this question, what we realized is there is no one-size-fits-all approach. And so what we've done is we've come up with a set of guiding principles and a framework to help businesses develop their strategies. And I'll kick off with a bunch of guiding principles to kind of help the decision making. The first principle to talk about is beware the sound bites you read. They may not tell your story. And if we look at some of the news headlines down the right-hand side of this chart, only days apart, two very well-known publications were contradicting themselves as to whether inflation is going to get worse or get better. Similarly, only days apart, the same publication, on one hand, was saying in certain brands they're seeing consumers trading down, and on the other hand, some categories are seeing premium brands on the rise. So we can see a lot of contradictory messaging. And the reason is not all consumers are created equal, as we know. Some fared well during the pandemic and saved money. Some have seen an increase in wages. Some are really struggling. Not all categories weather the storm the same way. Different brands serve different needs, have different price elasticity. And so the message is, this is not a time to kind of buy into sweeping generalizations. This is a time to intimately know the nuances of your brand, your consumer, and your market. The second principle to keep in mind when you're going through developing your strategies is to distinguish short-term behavioral responses from long-term trends. Now, we all read marketing media, and we know how marketing media loves to hype change, but often in a way that is disproportionate to how consumer behavior really changes. We all saw headlines that nobody's ever going to go back into the cinema ever again. Well, we saw Top Gun beat all box office records recently. The point being that as we are going through this period of change, it's important to understand what are short-term behavioral responses today versus what are the long-term trends tomorrow. And to give you an example, if we look at e-commerce as a proportion of total retail sales in the US, there've recently been a lot of headlines saying, you know, retail e-commerce is dropping. Yes, it is, but really all that's happened is that it's returning to a pre-pandemic trajectory. We're seeing the same thing with the likes of Netflix, of Peloton. So again, understanding the difference between long-term trends versus short-term behavior changes. And the third principle is find the courage to drive growth even when instinct is telling you to contract. Now, we totally get that it's a very difficult time for many businesses right now. There's a lot of pressure coming down from the finance departments looking at cutting costs, rising prices. But the point being that even in these times, and especially in these times, there are still opportunities to drive growth and innovation. And I'm sure if we all look around our own neighborhoods during the pandemic, we saw examples of some businesses that actually thrived during very difficult times and some that closed the doors. What was the difference between them? And for some inspiration, we know some very well-known brands that have fared really well during times of economic stress and uncertainty. Who would have thought that Disney launched straight after the Great Depression? Mickey Mouse was introduced in 1928. Disney pushed through that period of the Great Depression, knowing that America needed to smile more than ever at that time. And the first movie launched just after the Great Depression, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. Airbnb was born out of the financial crisis of 2007. And Steve Jobs and his team at Apple have gone on record to say that when times are tough, that is when they invest more in R&D. And we've seen cases where they launch more products during times of recession, and so that after the recession, they come out of the gates running, and we've seen their stock price respond accordingly. With that inspiration as context, how do businesses identify these opportunities? How do they approach decision-making at this time? And the way we see it is that at this time, businesses need to play offense as well as defense. And what do we mean by that? There's a lot being written around marketing at the moment around a lot of defensive strategies to respond to inflation, such as companies dealing with rising prices, reducing costs. We've heard about shrinkflation, smaller product sizes, smaller packaging. And while that may be necessary in the short term, if we keep stripping out from the consumer, what it means from their perspective is that they receive less. The risk is that they start feeling undervalued. And the greater risk is that we erode brand loyalty over the long term. And so as businesses, as we are stripping out from the customer experience on the left side of the ledger, we need to make sure that we are adding value to the customer and the full brand experience on the right side of the ledger. Similarly, we absolutely understand that at this time of a crisis, short-term tactics are required to respond to immediate needs of businesses. And while those short-term tactics are important, they cannot be at the expense of long-term planning. We've got to remember we will come out of this period of crisis. And so we need to make sure that businesses are setting themselves up for success well beyond this inflationary period, to a time where once again consumers have money in their wallets. If we bring these two axes together, we have a framework that will help businesses take a very holistic approach to developing, evaluating, and prioritizing growth strategies. And I'll go through each quadrant really briefly. Number one, defensive strategies in the short term. This is where we leverage the full portfolio. As we've seen, there's trading down, there's trading up. It's about managing the full portfolio across the price range and communicating effectively if there are price hikes and product changes. Short-term offensive strategies, that's making sure that you're very clear on what your brand value proposition is. It's about investing in the full customer brand experience. I'll come back to that in a minute. Long-term offensive strategy, this is where we still keep an eye on the prize of the future. What are the trends? What's the innovation that's going to keep business success long after the crisis? And long-term defensive strategies, of course, this is an opportunity to review and optimize all cost and supply chain structures. We believe that businesses need to cover the board and adopt strategies that really talk to all four quadrants. For the sake of time today, I'll go a little bit further into quadrant 2. What can businesses do in the short term to apply offensive strategies? The first point to make is businesses need to show empathy and create human connection. We can't underestimate what consumers, or just people, have been through over the last few years. And so this is a time to show that businesses understand their consumers with empathy and thought. Great example is Arizona Iced Tea, a brand here in the US. The co-founder was gone on record to say he's committed to the 99-cent price point. And I quote, "Consumers don't need another price increase from a guy like me." Second example is from Hyundai, a great example of a business that rose to the needs of consumers at a particular point in time and innovated to meet those needs. Hyundai Assurance was launched in 2009 as a protection program offered now in times of an unprecedented national crisis. What this incredible product did is that when consumers bought a vehicle during the 2009 crisis, if they went on to involuntarily lose their job within a year, they could sell their vehicle back up to a certain price point. A great example of innovation with empathy. And finally, this is a time to think about what is the value proposition of your brand. Great example from Louis Vuitton, where they realized they are not a brand that sells handbags. They are a brand that is all about luxury. And so during the 2009 financial crisis, where people could not afford a $1,500 handbag, they started promoting the keyring. $300, but a taste of luxury at a time when times were tough. And what this did was it grew the customer base so that when the crisis was over, where people had more money in their wallets, once again, handbag sales increased and the share price followed. And I'll end off with this quote, and we've selected it because it really sums up with data and with proof that whole idea of having a growth mindset at this difficult time, about really finding the courage to drive growth when, as I say, instinct is telling a lot of businesses to contract. And what the data shows is that those businesses that really invest in R&D, in innovation at a time of the crisis, they are way more likely to become industry leaders once the crisis is over. And with that point, I'm going to hand back to Jennifer.
Thanks a lot, Janice. And I'm sure your framework is going to be very welcome by lots of the people on the call, because it really helps frame the whole idea. And you've been working on these strategies with lots of clients. I know you've been engaging with many different brands, industries, countries. And I was wondering, what are the key questions that clients are coming with on this topic of what to do in these times?
And Jennifer, you've hit the nail on the head. The bottom line is people don't know what to do because every day they are reading a different headline that's telling them different things. And so that's why we're encouraging brands to really get to understand their market and their consumer. And I think the biggest aha that's coming from clients is they were so used to hearing messages of, you know, rising prices, reducing costs, and helping clients get back to that good old solid marketing principles that even and especially in this time of crisis becomes more important than ever.
Great. So a good reminder, as Jean-Christophe was also saying, that the basics are still there to guide us. Thanks a lot. And comms is one of the key ones in which what to do is a huge question. So we're very keen to listen from Aurélie and Laurent what their learnings are. Over to you guys.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. So happy, really happy to be here and share some insights about, communication. So Janice talked about, the different strategies companies using to navigate in inflation times, but what does it require when it comes to communications and messages? And that's why we wanted to launch a web series officially on Monday, which is called Inside Inflation, What Comes Next? So in this new web series, we're going to, follow how brands are responding to inflation in terms of communications. Who are they? What kind of comm strategy they're using? What can we learn from the do's and the don't? And what are the learnings from our data sets? But before that, let's start with the big picture. And I think Simon and Jean-Christophe shared earlier, if we look at what people are facing today, I mean, they have a lot to worry about. Thinking about the Ukraine war, the gas shortage, supply chain pressure, and also dealing with some political scandals and the repetition of the heat waves and forest fires in US, but also in Europe. And now, people start to feel that the prices are increasing. And if you look at what's coming in the corner is actually a possible recession. So let's look back, and Laurent, what did brands, learn under COVID where people were also under such a lot of pressure?
Well, The lesson from COVID was very simple. Stay close to people, don't fake it, and use empathy to truly connect to everyone. In these two examples that we see on the screen, Dove and Guinness developed campaigns in extreme coherence with people's existing knowledge, so what they knew and what they remember from the brands, but really in tune with the feeling of the time, right? So it was relevant for the brands, but it was also very making sense for people. So now with inflation, so how does it do with marketers? Well, we are seeing, we are reading, we've crunched a lot of articles and stuff, and what we see in terms of comms is cutting ad budget, cutting price, and promote that message, communicate around affordability, and again, this horrible word, sorry, it's shrinkflation. So what Jean-Christophe was describing, you reduce basically a chocolate bar, but you charge the same to people. So it's not a general rule, but few brands have tried that. We can debate about how effective this is going to be in the long term, but everything has something in common. Marketers seems to act a little bit defensive way, like Janice was describing. This is what we actually observe. So far, few brands are playing the card of authenticity and clarity and transparency about why they are increasing the price and how they are going to do it. Few brands are communicating around that. So when we ask people, across many markets, so beyond LATAM, for example, now it's more of a North America and Europe and some countries in Asia, where inflation hits them. Basically, it's grocery, food, utilities. It has a big psychological impact on them because this is frequent purchases. And so this is really making them worry, basically. So with a lot of people worrying, how can brand respond and how can they communicate messages that are sort of interesting? And to be honest, we've crunched a lot of articles and stuff, but and our database again, but few of the brands are really daring something different yet. But let's share two examples here on the screen. I don't know if you can make them run, Aurélie. Yes. On the left is Tesco, a UK brand which is leveraging basically its everyday low price kind of perception for acquiring customers, not for grocery, but for their mobile phone operation, right? Because people are making trades off between categories. They are trying to get advantage of that. And we believe that's, they make it in a quirky and funny way. On the right-hand side, which another strategy is from Pizza. They are communicating around affordability with a subscription offer. So basically, they propose to keep their pizza price of $13 for a year if people subscribe to the offer. They're trying to change people's habits. They're trying to reframe the value they offer by changing, impulse pizza buy with more rituals and habitual purchases. So we think it's something that is going to stick around probably. Finally, we looked at our data sets in terms of which are those brands that are trying and that are doing things differently with inflation. So on the tab here, you can see that value brands are starting to be really aggressive with price and promotions in building their own sales. It's not the case for premium brands. So since Q1 and Q2, we've seen that happening a lot, and that's why they were the first vocal, retailers and value brands to take on the stage, basically. So Aurélie, what are the right message now to convey to people in terms of inflation, and how can we do it?
Well, I think that the first thing that, because we've been crushing and you were saying this, Laurent, and we've been digging a little bit in our database, and what we can say that what strikes us really that what drives great advertising, is already changing. And as you can see on this chart, I mean, like in the hard time of COVID, empathy is getting traction again with the rise of memorable ads made for people like me or makes me feel good. And I think that's a sign that advertising needs to focus even more on people and make sure that brands feel for them. But, if you think about empathy, that's really interesting. But can you, communicate about empathy and price in a smart way? Not easy. But well, let's take some inspiration from a great example from the Mint Mobile advertising. So Mint Mobile, just to give you some information, is a US telecom provider. It's owned by the actor Ryan Reynolds. And this ads is really portraying a nice way to talk about price without forgetting, the focus on people. Let's have the view.
So
At Mint Mobile, we like to do the opposite of what Big Wireless does. They charge you a lot, we charge you a little. They put their names on arenas, we put ours on my lower back. So naturally, when they announced they'd be raising their prices due to inflation, we decided to deflate our prices due to not hating you. And if this were one of their ads, they'd end it here with a happy customer. So we'll end ours with an angry goat. Ooh, look at the angry goat.
So why this ad is so successful? And as you can see on my chart, it reaches an index score of 211 index, which is showing a great creative effectiveness. So why is it so successful? Number one, empathy is real. You see the setting and the Ryan Reynolds, they are credible. They are credible because you see a simple production for a low-cost provider, basically, which makes totally sense for the audience. And also, the speech is done by a celebrity, which helps, of course, to get people's attention. But it is also very credible because Ryan Reynolds owns the company. So it's really about his company, his decision, his speech. Number two, Mint Mobile acts as a challenger. So it means that it stays true to itself, right? So they break conventions and it pays off. And while remaining true to the brand and talking about price in a funny way, they did not forget to bring back humor during a difficult time for people. But I think it's not for recap, no? So let's see what we've learned during this great webinar in a few minutes together. So fact number one, if we have to think about, the value brands are really the first to communicate about inflation. So what does it mean? It means that, you need to monitor your desirability and the gap of price perception with competition and make sure also that your price perceptions remain relevant. At some point, you may want to start play defense and reframe the value and the price perception, like in pizza. Fact number two, clearly empathy is critical to make great ads and as getting really a lot of traction right now. So what does it mean? It means that knowing your audience, which is a good, thing to have in marketing, is good, but is not enough. You need to make sure they understand you feel for them. And number three, you have to stay true to yourself, meaning true to your positioning, brand positioning in your advertising. So what does it mean? It means that you don't need to, you need to build on existing memories to communicate about affordability and unique brand value. So in other words, even if you intend, to lower your ad spends, which would make sense, during such a hard time, you need to make sure that you make on air high quality advertising. So Laurent, I think we have also, on top of what the first nuggets we exchanged today, I think we have a great news to share.
Yeah, thank you for your attention today. Our episode 1 of our new web series will be live next Monday with more examples, a lot of other insights. So please stay tuned and connect on ipsos.com. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Over to you, Jennifer.
Thank you very much. Very exciting to hear you're going to have chats on this topic ongoing. That's great. And you had some great learnings there. Lots of inspiration. But I wonder if I asked you to give us just the one tip from all of this that you've told us, the one tip to do great advertising in inflationary times, what would that be?
How? It's always complicated, and I think I might be a little bit disappointed because there is no magic recipe. But I think that if we are all to agree on one key principle, it would be for sure empathy. right? Empathy should be seen as a springboard as well to creativity, you know. So as it was reminding by Jean-Christophe and Janice as well about getting to know your audience is of course a must-have, and we need to think, of course, about this thing first before making any advertising. But on top of this, I would say that you need to make sure that your audience feel, you know, that you understand them. That's really important. So authenticity, credibility are also very, very meaningful for people and should be played.
Great. So empathy that really comes across. So thank you very much. And thank you to all our speakers. And now we have a special bonus because we're going to have a little chat around questions. We're very happy to have lots of viewers who have typed in little questions. So Simon, I think you've been checking that, and I'm going to hand over to you to provide some answers.
Well, yes, I know I have indeed, and I think one thing just to start with, being you talked earlier minutes about being authentic. Well, to be authentic, some of our viewers have their senses have been stimulated because the first question is about chocolate. And it's for Jean-Christophe because, but it does play into a bigger question because your example of the chocolate in Chile, Jean-Christophe, where it has shrunk at the same price, and the question was there a consumer backlash, or was that deemed to be the brand actually accommodating our needs in a difficult environment?
Yeah, I mean, it has been, from my point of view, a tactical decision, you know, because you have overall two different alternatives. I talked briefly about that. No, if you don't want to increase your cost and to increase your price, and sometimes you have two different alternatives. And many companies and many categories are using this tactic, let's say, no, to have a smaller product overall, keeping the same price. On another side, some other companies, and we are doing a lot of tests about that. Now they are looking to a lower cost formula. I mean, a lower cost to produce the same product, keeping the same size, but finding a way to produce with a lower cost. No, and today, just answering your question, in Argentina, we are doing quite a lot of tests for food categories regarding how they can and product tests. No, that they develop a new formula which is cheaper to produce, but with the same volume, and they test the appetence of the consumer for this new formula. And we are doing quite a lot of that. So there is two alternatives. Now your product is a bit smaller, or you find a new formula to develop the same one, but at lower cost.
Yeah. Well, your point about the categories actually came up with another question, which I think might want to ask Janice. I think it was your example of the being true to your value proposition. You know, you had the luxury example, and one of our colleagues on the call was interested in maybe your advice on a slightly different category, maybe over the counter healthcare, and perhaps just interested in any thoughts you had on how they might adapt, let's say, in such an environment.
That's really interesting, and I think, yes, luxury is one thing because it can handle, you know, that kind of price point. I think in terms of over the counter, I'll give an example of a slightly different category, but in CPG. There was an example of Gillette during high inflation in Turkey, and instead of looking at the price point, because their blades for razors are more expensive than the competition, and instead of communicating about price, they reinforced the quality and the longevity of their product. So potentially that's something that you could do for over the counter as well, which is making sure people understand the value that if you buy these blades, for example, they may be expensive in the short term, but they will last you much longer. Again, you could play that into higher quality products for over the counter.
Well, actually, I'm going to, if I may just stay with you one more, Janice, because we had a question about that, because it was around, should I be searching for growth at all costs, and how do I build sustainability into the equation in this sort of slightly disrupted situation?
Another great example that comes to mind as you asked about sustainability, Simon, is there was an example for Omo, and I cannot remember the country, I think it was in South America, and they actually did a really good job of combining a sustainability benefit with a lower cost benefit. So what they did for washing powder is that they created a refill pack. so that it brought down the price point of buying a new product, and at the same time they pushed the sustainability messaging, again adding value back to the customer experience while taking away cost.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. Well, and on one of the things that came up, I think perhaps there were some parallels between what we're talking about today, inflationary times, and perhaps 2 years ago when we started doing this webinar series. It was during COVID times, and this is perhaps one for Aurélie, and Laurent might want to come in as well. But we all remember there was a period maybe after about 3 months of COVID where there were a sense that the adverts were a little bit the same at unprecedented times. And I think one of the participants on the call was interested in what's different this time now about inflationary times versus those COVID times we were going through a couple of years ago. Can you see any differences in terms of what you need to communicate and how to get the message across, or is it actually following the same sorts of principles?
Well, it's different and the same at the same time. You know, it's because of course empathy was well played. When it was well played during COVID, it proved that it was quite effective in terms of advertising. But again, I mean, you can't expect people to be the same during COVID that during inflation. So it comes back to the question of what empathy and knowing your audience means during those tough times. So I think it's really about how authenticity looks like during inflation, what kind of messaging your brand can carry on, and how can you bring this idea of being yourself without losing, of course, this authentic touch. You need to be yourself. You need to address what your audience is expecting during this tough time. So probably different, but yeah, close principle.
Okay, thank you for that. Now we've got one person who's a little bit tried to look at things the other way around. They seem to like all of the advice that you're giving. I'm going to come to you first for this one, Jean-Christophe. It's what would your advice be on what not to do during the coming period? Perhaps so with your 20 years of Latin America experience, what should organizations
can I say, don't do nothing. I mean, don't just sit away. Be my advice, but
we should do something.
Christophe has to say.
Anything else, Jean-Christophe? What should you not do?
Not to do, maybe not to look to change everything. No, I mean, each brand, each product has a specific positioning and specific benefits, and so don't look to change everything. No, just look to innovate, to adapt, to fine tune. But don't change anything. Don't look to change anything. No, just look for adaptation. No.
Thank you. I'll come to you next, Janice. If any don'ts as well as any do's that you would suggest we think about as we look ahead.
I think this is about don't forget the consumer. And I know that might sound an obvious point on this call, but I think people are so focused on the business side and the supply chain and operations that sometimes at the most important time, the consumer can be forgotten.
That's absolutely good. Absolutely well made. And it's that sort of for you, Aurélie, you were telling us to not forget the people just a moment ago. But any disasters that you spotted in advertising or communications that you might privately advise us to avoid?
Yeah, and I think that, you know, that's also the point of having a web series, because obviously as long, you know, as we go, we will learn and we will spot for sure many examples. But I can already, I mean, the episode 1 will be released on Monday, but we are also working obviously on episode 2. And yeah, sometimes, I mean, we've seen some examples, and that there is something I can share, that when you try to, because you're tempted to talk about price, right, during inflation. But when you try to paste, you know, this price message in a communication which is very different in terms of messages from what you were about to say as a brand, then it just don't work, because it just acts as a tag that you put on top of who you are. So it has to stay relevant in terms of message you are delivering. So I think stay tuned for episode 1 and 2, and you will know more, and we will share more examples of what do's and don'ts.
Well, looking forward to that. Laurent, was there anything? I know we just missed you for a moment, Laurent, but we were thinking about any, as already says, any don'ts or things you advise clients on the call not to do during the coming period.
No, I think it's very striking because in the learnings we had, we looked at with Aurélie, there was some similar setting by brand. So like a sort of a format of ad which looks very similar. Okay, so look at think about the Meet Mobile, for example. There was a very similar ad in the same setting, a talking head, someone talking to you. So someone trying to engage you as a viewer, right? But because the brand was not right, it was absolutely not working. So again, there is no universal recipe. It's all about who you are, again, and how you can evolve and make yourself adjustments with an inflationary context. And it's not about time to reinvent yourself. Absolutely not. I fully agree with Jean-Christophe. It's time for adjustment.
Okay, thank you. Well, one of the and certainly, I think the evidence you've all collected here will help us all just think through some of those levers that we can pull. One of the questions we've had on a number of occasions is, are we going to get the charts? And everyone listening will of course have those tomorrow. But thank you, everybody. I'm going to hand back to Jennifer, who's been with us all the way through. Jennifer, I didn't know if you had any final thoughts or observations listening to the presentations and indeed to our discussion just now.
My final thoughts are definitely to take all this advice on board and make good use of it, because I think we've shared some great nuggets of wisdom, and I'm sure everyone will be very keen to take those on board. And also, I'd like to remind everyone that we will be delighted to see you again in October for our next Keys webinar on Thursday the 20th, and this will be about generations, another very hot topic. So thank you, everyone. Thanks to the speakers, and thanks to everyone who was with us today. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.